What's going on, guys? So in this video, we're going to take a look at the 5 different methods that we have to styling a React application. And before we get started, I just want to quickly go over the code that I have in front of us. And you'll see that we just have a basic React application that I created using Create React App. And we've got 3 main components. I've got the standard app component. And this app component is going to render out 2 custom components that I've made. I've got the login button component and the payment button component. And if we take a look at those 2 components, you'll see that from a JSX perspective, they're just returning a button, right? So the login button is just going to return the word login, and then the payment button is going to return the text pay now. And if we take a look at what this application looks like, you can see we've got the login button and the pay now button. Nothing special. I wanted to start out with something very simple. All right, so let's take a look at the first way that we can style our React application, and that is by using inline styles. Just like when it comes to working with a regular non-React based application, the first way that you learn CSS is usually through inline style. So I figured that's a good starting point. So let's take a look at our login button and let's see how we can go ahead and style this. So when it comes to inline styles, the way that we do this with the React application is we have to pass the style prop to whatever JSX element that we want to style. So here I'll do style equals, and then you'll need curly braces. And then within here, we have to pass in a JavaScript object. And when it comes to creating a JavaScript object, remember, the object itself is going to be within curly braces. So we have to do another set of curly braces. So really, it's style equals and then 2 curly braces. Don't forget that. I guarantee you at some point, you're going to try to write this out with 1 curly brace, and you're going to wonder why you get an error. And then I'm just going to hit enter here just to space it out. And then we're going to pass in our CSS styles as basically JavaScript object parameters or properties. And so let's say that I want to set the width of the button. I just do width. And then I do colon, and then here we have to put this as a string, essentially. We then do what we want our width to be. So we can do 100 pixels, we can do 100%, we can do whatever, normal CSS values that you want to provide to your width. So I'm going to say this, the width of this button is going to be 100 pixels. And let's say I want to set the height. So we do height, and then we also set this to some value. So I'm going to do 50 pixels. Once again, I could use viewports, I can do EMs, REMs, all of those options are available to us when it comes to inline styles as well. And then now I want to set the background color. So when it comes to applying the background color in traditional CSS, we would do background-color, right? However, this doesn't work with React. For React, what we have to do is to get this property to work with our React application is we have to remove the dash, and then we have to capitalize the the first letter of the second word. So it's basically just traditional camel case. And you'll see that if you're using VS Code, you're going to get auto completion anyway. So if I type in background, you'll see that we have all of our options. So you can see the camel case version of that CSS property. So we select background color. And then I'm just going to set this to something simple like blue. And then a few more things. I'll set the color, and then we'll set that to white. And then remember, you got to do the comma after each property, just like any other JavaScript object. We'll set the border to none, just because it always looks hideous on buttons. And then finally, we'll set the border radius. And I want you guys to figure out what is the name of that property within React, right? Because normally it's border-radius. However, we have to change that. So what are the rules? Well, remember, we just remove the dash, capitalize the first letter of the second word. And so now we've got border radius, and we can set this to be 10 pixels, just to round out the edges just a little bit. So now if I hit save and we go to our page, we can see that now our button is successfully styled. It's inherited all of those styles. And if we take a look at our the Chrome developer tools and then just take a look at this, we can see that it did apply these styles inline. So we got the button right here, and we can see all of the styles that have been applied inline. And what's nice about doing it like this is that, remember, this is just a JavaScript object. And so if you take a look at how our JSX looks, it's a little cluttered, especially, seeing as how this is just one button. If we had a couple of different elements that we want to render out, having all these styles right here would start to get really messy. So what we can do is I can go outside of my class or really anywhere else, and I can define, we'll call this styles. And then I could set this to be this exact object. So I could just cut out this object, paste it in here, and then I can just pass in styles. Right? And so this looks a lot nicer. I've got my actual component down here, and then I've got all the styles separated up here. And so now if I go take a look, once again, We can see all of these styles being applied just right, and we can see that the button is properly colored. Now, just like with any non-React based application, generally you don't want to do inline CSS styles for everything. Instead, I would rather put all of my CSS styles in a separate style sheet so that I can just import it into my application and then reference those styles like we would with any other project. So let's take a look at how we can do that with React. And so first of all, we're going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to get rid of my inline styles. I don't need those anymore. And I'm going to remove the style prop. Now, when it comes to creating a style sheet, all we have to do is go under our source directory, create a new file, and then give a name to your style sheet. So in this case, I'm just going to call this, we'll call this login button .css. All right, so I just named it after my component just because these are going to be the styles that are going to be used for this specific component. But once again, you can name your CSS file anything that you want, and you can have more than one. Now, this is a regular CSS file, so I'm just going to create a class right here. So I'm going to reference the button class. And then we're just going to copy the same exact properties that I had before. So I'm going to copy these real quick. And I'm going to paste it in. All right, so we've got the same exact properties. However, I've changed the syntax back. So instead of the camel case, I put the dash and the lowercase letters so that it's traditional CSS, right? This is nothing specific to React. This is just plain CSS at this point. You don't need to change anything around. All right, so now we've got this style sheet. And what I want to do is I want to, first of all, assign that button class to this button. So I can do, the way you do that is you do the class name prop. So you pass in the class name prop, and then you set this equal to, and then we're going to give the name of the classes we want to assign into this button. So I'm just going to give this one class, and we will call this button. So this button element is going to have just one class. If I wanted to add an extra class, I could just add this, and then we could just say, hey, how about primary? Right? So this would give us a primary button. But in this case, we're just going to have one class. Now, if I hit save at this point, you can see it's not styled, right? And that's because even though we created this style sheet, we still have to import it into one of our React components. So to import it, we do import. And then you do the path to the style sheet. So this style sheet is in the same directory as login button. So I'm just going to do // and then login button.css. All right. And so if I hit save, we can see that now it is now successfully styled once again. And if we take a look at the Chrome developer tools, and I'm going to zoom in for us just a little bit. All right. If we take a look at the button right here, you can see that it no longer has any inline styles, but it did receive a class of button. So when we pass in class name, right, it is now the class property. And keep in mind, right, this is class name. There's going to be a few times where you forget to put the name and you just put in class, but don't worry, React will throw errors and let you know the mistake that you made. It's something that's very common. So just make sure class name and you capitalize the second letter or the name or the first letter of the second word. All right, but what I want to do is if we go up to the head right here and we go to styles, which is right down here at the bottom, right, you could see our style sheet. So this is what got imported when we do import login button.css. So it imports this. And so now we have access to the styles associated with the button class. Now there's one thing to note about this, and that is that this style is global. And what I mean by that is if any other element, any other component has the button class to assign to it, it's going to inherit these exact properties. And I'll prove that to you. So we've got this payment button, right? And so this is already being rendered out into our application, and you can see the payment button, which right now is not styled. If I go to payment button and I assign a class, which if you guys remember how to do that, it's just class name equals, and then we give it the same button class, right? This is the same class that we assigned to the login button right here. And I hit save. Let's see what happens. You can see that now the payment button is also styled. Why is that, right? In my payment button class or my payment button function or this component, I'm not importing that style sheet, right? Only login button is importing it. Payment button is not. So why is it able to access those classes? Well, it's because when you do this import syntax, it's global. These styles are global, so any other component in your application has access to those styles and to those classes. And so this is something to keep in mind because a lot of times people think that, hey, if you import it into a component, it should only be accessible within the component. And that's not exactly how React works by default. Any component, any HTML element in your project will be able to access those classes and inherit those styles. So there's times when that can be good, and there's times when that can create problems. Just like in this case, right? I may not want my payment button to be styled exactly the same way as my login button. And so what would I have to do to kind of get around this? Well, I would probably have to name my button classes something different. I'd have to probably incorporate something like BEM. So I'd have to do like something like button dash, I don't know, we'll call this login, and then payment button would be like button dash payment. And then, within this CSS class, I'd have to change this to button dash login. And then I would create a new style sheet for payment button and do the same thing. And then, I find that this kind of becomes a little bit unnecessary. It becomes a little complex because I have these long class names, these long, disgusting class names, and I have to figure out, and I have to make sure that these class names don't clash between different components. But we'll take a look at the next section or a section or two from now to figure out how we can get around this limitation. For now, I'm just going to remove this and keep this everything as default for now. And so in the next section, we'll take a look at how we can incorporate SASS and SCSS. Now, I know some of you guys don't like to use traditional CSS and prefer to use something like SASS or SCSS. And the great part about React is that it's already set up to work with SASS or SCSS. We just have to install one simple package, and that is going to be node-sass. If you do npm install node-sass, this is going to allow us to work with SASS and SCSS files. All right, so go ahead and run that. I've already installed this in my application. So the way we do SASS or SCSS is go ahead and just take our CSS file and just rename it to a SASS file. So I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to change this to an SCSS file. I prefer SCSS. This is just my personal preference, just because when you use SCSS, regular CSS is still perfectly valid. If you like to use SASS, feel free to do that. Once again, both of them work out of the box with React. I'm going to change that. So now it's able to detect that this is a SASS file. And just to prove that it's SASS, I'm going to just add a few different properties for the hover state. So I'm going to say and hover. So when we hover over this button, we're going to change a few properties. So I'm going to set the background color to be red. Actually, I'm going to set it to be white. And then we'll set the text color to be blue. And then we'll give it a border now. 1 pixel, solid blue. All right, so this, I added this just to show you guys this is in fact SCSS and not just CSS. And so to import this, I want you guys to take a guess at exactly what you have to do, because it's going to be a lot simpler than you think it is, right? Because right now we're importing the CSS file, which doesn't exist. All we do is we just import the SCSS file. It's as simple as that. So if I hit refresh, or if I save this, hit refresh, and let me just go to the other terminal just to make sure that there's no issues, right? It's not reporting any errors. And if we go back to our project, we can see that everything is good to go. And if we take a look at the style sheet, wherever that is, we should see our button class is now there. And then we also see the hover state as well. And then let's hover over it and look at that. Works perfectly. Now, that's all I wanted to show you guys from a SASS and SCSS perspective, because you don't really have to do anything. I'm just going to change this back to regular CSS for the next lesson so that it doesn't cause any potential issues. So I'm just going to rename this. I'm going to change this back to CSS. And then make sure we import just CSS. A couple sections ago, I mentioned that when we import a style sheet into a specific component, those styles are not exclusive to this component. They're in fact global styles, which means that any component in our application can make use of those styles. And that is ultimately why when we import this style sheet into login button, but we don't import it into payment button, because both of these buttons use the class button. So payment button has that class of button, and then login button has that same class. And this class is defined in login button. Because we're importing it into just one of our components, both buttons can end up using that same class. And so if we take a look at this, we can see that, hey, look, both buttons are styled, despite the fact that payment button is not importing that style sheet. So that's one of the downsides of having global styles in this case. right? You're going to see that you'll run into issues with classes potentially clashing between components. And so you'll see that you have to get really creative when it comes to CSS naming conventions, your class naming conventions. So you can do things like BEM to ensure that your class names are unique across components and HTML elements. So, for an example, I could do button-payment and then style this accordingly using a class called button-payment. And the login button can be button-login. However, you'll see that once your application grows to certain sizes, this just becomes an absolute pain to work with. And you'll wish that there was an easy way to kind of scope CSS classes so that a class can only be applied to one specific component. And there is, in fact, a way we can do that. And it actually comes pre-built with React. And this feature is called CSS modules. So I'm going to just remove these names real quick. So I'm just going to default back to the regular button. And I'm going to show you how we can incorporate CSS modules. So I have this style sheet right here. And to make this a module, a CSS module, all I have to do is just rename it. And I just rename it by doing .module. So we want to rename all of our CSS files to be .module.css. All right, and it's throwing an error just because I'm not importing any file called login button CSS. So we have to remove this import statement and change it. So your natural instinct is to just import module.css. However, that's not going to work. Instead, what we want to do is we want to do import, and then we have to give this a variable name. You can call this anything you want. You could just do the letter S. A lot of people like to do import it as styles because technically we are importing CSS styles. So it makes sense to name it that, but you can name it anything you want. And then we say from, and then we just pass the name of the file. So we're going to do a login button.module.css. And so to access these styles from this style sheet, all we have to do is go into the class name here. And I can pass in styles. And then here I have access to all of these styles within the style sheet. So if I go to this module, I have this class button. So I can call styles.button, and this is going to assign that specific class to this button. And the great part about doing it like this is that this style will only get applied to this component or this HTML element, right? That class that I created called button will not be applied to any other component. So even though this button right here, the payment button, is also using the button class, because I'm using CSS modules like this, you'll see that we won't accidentally pick up those styles as well. And I'll prove that to you. So I'm going to save everything. And then we're going to go back to our website and I'm going to do a refresh, right? Notice something. Now, take a look at this. Our login button is styled, but our payment button is no longer styled. And just to kind of reiterate what we've changed, if we take a look at our style sheet, we still have a class button. And if we look at our login button, we're assigning styles.button. So we're importing those styles and then we're applying the button class. But if we go to payment button, we still have the button class here. So we have now successfully taken the styles from this style sheet and scoped it to this component so that they're only applied to this component. And if you want to see how CSS modules actually accomplish that, if we go to the style sheet right here, look at this. It creates a class that we actually technically didn't create ourselves, right? It's called login button, and so that's going to come from the name of the. I don't remember if it's going to be the name of the component or the name of the. I'm assuming it's coming from the name of the CSS module, but I named them the same, so I can't actually say for certain. So it takes that name. It then applies the class name, right? So the class name is button, so it takes the module name, and then the actual class name, and then it appends some arbitrary string, some random number, some hash of some kind. Right? And that's what allows this to be unique. And so if I go down to my body and we open up that div, you'll see that the button got that specific class. So that's why only one button is styled accordingly. And then the other button is styled something else. And the great part about this is, now take a look at this. I'm going to create a new file. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this module right here. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it. And I'm going to rename this second one. We'll call this payment button.module.css. All right. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color of this to be red. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to import this new CSS module that I created into payment button. So I'll do import. We do the same syntax. So styles from. And then we'll call this payment button.module.css. And then we'll apply the button class from here. So we'll do button, styles. We have to access this object, so styles, and then .button. So we're going to import the class button from here. So he's going to incorporate all of these styles. So we'll save everything. And let's take a look. Now we can see that both of these buttons are styled differently, despite the fact that both of them use the same button class. So we can now reuse the same names across all of our style sheets and be 100% certain that they will only be scoped to the specific components that they're imported into because of CSS modules. And if we take a look at what happens when it comes to the styles, you'll see that we have two styles. So we've got the login button style that I showed you guys already. And if we scroll down, you'll see that there's another style sheet. And this one has the payment button. And it uses the same exact name formatting, right? It takes the module name. It then takes the class name from the style sheet and then just appends some arbitrary numbers to keep it unique, right? And CSS modules handles creating those arbitrary numbers and letters to keep it unique. And you're going to be 100% certain that they're always going to be unique. And then if we go down to the two buttons, you'll see that they get both of those classes applied accordingly. Now, if you want to use CSS modules with SASS or SCSS, guess what? It's going to work right out of the box as well. And that's another fantastic part about React. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to add the hover state. We'll do hover. And actually, let me rename this first so it doesn't throw any errors. I'm going to use SCSS because that's my preferred method. And we're going to apply that. We'll save that. And then I'm going to do the same thing for payment button module.scss. So let me rename that. And I'm just going to change a few things. So this is going to be red. And this is going to be red as well. If we save everything, we just have to go in and rename this to be SCSS. So we import the new names. All right, and then if we take a look at this, if we do our hover state, whoops, it looks like it didn't work. And it looks like I messed something up. Give me 1 second, guys. All right, so let's take a look. All right, so I changed the colors. Now we can see that, look at that. We got the hover state, we got the hover state. So CSS modules works right out of the gate with SASS or SCSS, depending on whichever one you prefer. All right, guys. So the last technique that I want to show you guys when it comes to incorporating CSS into your application is CSS in JavaScript. So there's a couple of different packages that help you incorporate CSS in JavaScript. One of the more popular ones is called styled components. So I'm going to just give you a brief run through on how you can use styled components to style your project. Keep in mind, this isn't going to be an in-depth overview of styled components. I'll probably have a video of styled components coming up in maybe a couple of weeks or so. So definitely stay tuned for that, but I'm just going to give you just a quick run through just to give you the high-level principles of how you can use it to style your application. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to install styled components. So go ahead and do an npm install styled-components. And I've already got it installed, so I'm not going to hit enter in that case. Just make sure you guys do that. Once you have styled components installed, I'm going to show you guys how we can create a brand new component and style it. So I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this how about submit button? I know you guys are probably tired of buttons, but and I'm just going to create a simple functional component. And this is going to return just a plain old button. And this will say submit. And let's make sure that we wire this up into our app component. So I'm just going to add this down here. And let's just put it on a separate line. And then we'll say submit button. All right. And so after we incorporate that, you see our submit button down here. It's unstyled. And so the way we style this is going to be actually a little bit of a different mindset. So what we want to do is we want to import styled from styled-components. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to create our own custom components that are already styled, if that makes sense, right? We're going to have pre-built components that come built in with styles. And the way we do that is by, defining our new component. So I'm going to call this component styled button, because this represents a button that's already styled with all of my styles. And we set this equal to, and then we call styled, which we imported from styled components. And we say what type of element this component should be. So this is going to be a button, right? So this is no different than any other button within React or any of your applications. If I wanted an H1, I can do an H1. If I wanted a P tag, I can do a P tag. I have access to all of those, but since I'm just creating a simple button, I'm just going to do button. Then we want to do a template literal. So you do 2 backticks. And then within here, you just pass in all the styles you want for your button. And it's really as simple as that. So I'm going to do the same things. I'm going to give it a width. I'm going to say this is going to be 100 pixels. I'll give it a height of 50 pixels. We'll give it a background color. And remember, this is just regular CSS, so you don't need to do the camel case like that, like we did for the inline styles. It's just going to be regular CSS. I'm going to set this to green. And then we're going to set the color to white. We'll remove borders, and then we'll set the border radius to be 10 pixels. All right, so just regular CSS. And so what this created is our own React component. It's a React component called styled button that is nothing more than just a plain button with all of these styles already attached. And so now, if I want to render out this button, I don't need to call button. I'll just say, I want my styled button. Right? And so this is just a regular React component. And so now I can pass in whatever text I want for that. So in this case, I'll just say, since this is a submit button, it'll just say submit. And so now if I hit save, and we're going to take a look at this, our button is now styled exactly the way we want it to. And that's really one of the beautiful ideas behind styled components, is that we create the components that are already styled, and then we just reference them within our return statement as any other JSX element. And in this case, I've got the styles right above my actual component. I prefer to keep it like this. Some people like to move it to a separate file so that they keep these two things separate. If you want to move it to a file, you absolutely can. And I'll show you guys just how easy that is. So I'm going to create a new file. This will be called submit. I'll just call this styled button. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this part. And then just paste it into here. And then in our submit button, since we no longer have the style button here, all we have to do is import it like any other React component. And I actually forgot to export this, so I'll just do export default styled button. And then now we can import this. All right, so we imported that. Let's just save everything and let's make sure that everything's good. And now look at that. We've got our styled button. Just refresh it just to make sure there's nothing broken. And so now we can take this styled button and we can then use this in any other one of our components. We can use this in as many components as we'd like. And right now I'm fixing all of the properties, right? They're all fixed and I can't change anything. However, with styled components, you can pass things as props and then overwrite these values. So there's a lot of customizability when it comes to styled buttons, so that it's really easy to make reusable components. And that's always been something that I've struggled with, which is creating reusable components. I find that I always make so many one-off components. But with this, if I wanted a reusable button, right, I can just set this, like the background color to be a variable. And then you can pass in a prop to then set that variable to be whatever color you want. So there's a lot of flexibility with it. And I think just to kind of hammer home the whole idea or the whole thought process behind styled components, I'm just going to create one more component just to show you guys, so that hopefully you guys at least have a basic understanding of how styled components works, because it's nothing crazy. It's nothing too out there, but it is a little bit of a different mindset. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new component, and we'll call this, we'll say this represents like an article in our application. We have an article. I'm going to create a dummy functional component, and then let's just make sure that I wire this up into app.jsx. So I'm going to call article. All right. Now for this article, what I want to do is here I'm returning a div. And then what I want to do within this div, I'll have like a header for my article with some random text, and then I want to have some text that describes this article. And that's kind of all I want to do with this React component, right? I just want to have a div with some styling when it comes to centering it, and then a header, and then a p tag that goes a little bit more in depth to describe this specific article. And I'm going to show you guys how we can accomplish this with styled components. So once again, I'm going to import styled from styled components. And then for this div, I'm going to create a component. We can call this anything we want. I'm just going to call this a wrapper. So this is going to return a styled. And then remember, since I want a div, I just do .div. And then I do the 2 backticks. And then here we could just pass in all the properties we want. So I'm just going to say I want this to be a width of 50% of its container. And I want to say the margin is going to be set to 0 auto. This is going to center it in the middle. And then we'll give this a border of 2 pixels, solid and black. All right. And then for our H1, I'm going to create a styled component called title. So this is going to represent the title of our article. And we'll say styled. And then this is going to be, since we want an H1, I'm just going to make it an H1. And then we'll set the font family to be Arial, Helvetica. Oops, I spelled that wrong. Helvetica. And then sans serif. Color is going to be green. We'll set the weight. And then we'll set the font dash size to be 32 pixels. Right, and then lastly, I'm going to create one last styled component for the p tags down there, and I'll just call this text. And all I'm going to do for the text is just set the color to be, we'll say orange. All right, and so now I can swap out all of these, or I'll just comment those out. And then I can call my wrapper. So that's going to represent the div that wraps all the components. And then I can call my title component. And then I'm going to paste the text for my title. So we'll say top beaches in Florida. Oops. Florida. And then we can call my text component. And we'll say, these are must-see beaches. All right. And so now, I mean, we've got exactly what I wanted before, except all of these components are already styled with the exact styles that I want them to have. So if I hit save and we take a look at this, guys. We've got my article, which is absolutely stunningly styled, already in place. And so styled components is as easy as that. But keep in mind, guys, we barely touched the surface on styled components. There's so much flexibility with these things. I definitely recommend you take a look at the documentation to see some of the things that you're able to do with styled components. I just wanted to make sure that this video was just a quick, brief, high-level overview of the different options that we have when it comes to CSS within a React application. So, styled components is just one methodology. Keep in mind, styled components isn't the only CSS and JavaScript framework. There's other things like Emotion, and there's like 6 or 7 other popular ones as well. So definitely take a look at those as well. Don't just assume styled components is the default standard, although it is a very popular library. And so these were the 5 different ways that we can make use of CSS within React. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If there's anything else you guys want me to cover, especially from a React perspective, let me know. Drop a comment, and I'll be happy to record a video on that.